Today's talk is on Macbeth. Now, I want to argue that Macbeth poses certain problems which are unique even in Shakespeare, that's point one, and that Macbeth is possibly the most misinterpreted among Shakespeare's great tragedies. Now, when I say that it is the most misinterpreted, I have to qualify my statement, because otherwise it might seem that there is one correct interpretation, and we are living in an age of postmodernism, and even without postmodernism we speak of and know of the open text. The greatness of great literature precisely lies in the fact that it is amenable to diverse interpretations. There is no problem about that. But in the case of Macbeth, we see that I am going to specially focus on the history of some famous and great productions. They are great in their own right, but then I want to show how actually, why they missed the point, and how the different aspects of the play have not been integrated, even say by a director as great as Akira Kurosawa, or a relatively modern director, Rupert Brooke. Sorry, not Rupert Brooke, it is Rupert Gould. So let's begin from the beginning. Macbeth is a tragedy. And what is a tragedy? There is no escaping Aristotle. When Aristotle speaks about mimesis and that it's an imitation of a serious action, etc., etc., he raises one question which is still moot, though of course there are, not every critic is satisfied with Aristotle's explanation. Why is it, the question is, why is it that we get pleasure from an action which is obviously painful? Now, Aristotle's answer was katharsis, the Greek word, which means that tragedy arouses pity and fear, and through pity and fear it purges excess pity and fear, and it purifies human emotion. Now, this is, I would say, the most popular interpretation of catharsis and the most popular justification or explanation of the joy that we derive from tragedy. But then there was Nietzsche, who contradicted Aristotle, and in his book The Twilight of the Idols, he said that tragedy was actually the affirmation of life even in its strangest and sternest problems, the will to life rejoicing in its own inexhaustibility. That is what I called Dionysian. That is what I recognized as the bridge to the psychology of the tragic poet. Not in order to get rid of terror and pity, not in order to purge oneself of dangerous emotions through its vehement discharge. Aristotle misunderstood it that way. but beyond and terror, to realize in oneself the eternal joy of becoming. You see, this does not totally negate Aristotle, but this is different. Third, of course, is we would not go into many interpretations, but we at least know that getting a first-hand painful experience is quite different from seeing or watching or listening to that experience being enacted when it is mediated through art. That mediation makes all the difference. That gives us an aesthetic distance, and that allows us from safety to be free from the pain of directly being involved in that action and to enjoy suffering, which of course is one of those ineluctable facts of life. So, we would not so much spend time on the genre of or discussing time on the definition of tragedy or why tragedy gives us joy. We accept the fact that tragedy does give us joy, but then even then there is one problem. The protagonist of tragedy, what kind of person is he? What kind of a person should he be? Can we have this kind of catharsis, tragic joy, if we watch the representation of the flourishing of a wicked man, or just the destruction of a virtuous man? Here, Aristotle stuck to psychological realism. Again, this is a little controversial point, but Aristotle said that the hero of tragedy should not be entirely good, and he cannot be wicked. He cannot be, or he should not be entirely good, because he says the destruction of a good man will outrage our sense of justice. You can see that what he is doing is the mimetic action. He is judging by the same standard as we would judge an action which is unmediated in life, which is a little dicey, I should say. But I call this psychological realism, because in that case we look at the hero of tragedy in the same way that we look at a person in real life, and our reaction to his fortune or misfortune, his suffering, is likewise regulated by whether he deserves it or not. Similarly, Aristotle says, so this is what I call psychological realism, and psychological realism may not be the greatest explanation of our response to tragedy, because, and we can clearly see that Nietzsche does not accept this, or even Schopenhauer in The World as Will and Idea speaks about modes of union or modes of manifestation of the world will, and that can only come with when the destruction of the individuality, which Nietzsche calls the Apollonian principle, dissolves. And if that is the case, then of course the theory of Aristotle's theory of psychological realism does not hold true. But we are again, our focus is on Macbeth, not on tragedy per se or the theories of tragedy. So we would move away from this. We will also say that following psychological realism, Aristotle also said in the Poetics that similarly we must not see a wicked man, or we are outraged when a wicked man flourishes. So the tragic hero cannot be wicked, because we need to have a kind of a sympathy, and we have to have pity, and we need to feel terror, and that is possible only when we see certain flaws in the man's character, but also certain virtues. Overall, he is better than most men really are. And therefore, actually, Aristotle speaks of hamartia, which is less of flaw and more of an error of judgment. Now I'll cut to Macbeth. If we apply the Aristotelian categories explicitly or implicitly, or if we think that virtue of some form is an important aspect of the tragic hero, some goodness, then does Macbeth qualify as a tragic hero? Macbeth, of course, is a villain that is through his, when you see his action, what happens is Macbeth murders a king who has been described by Macduff. Thy father was the most sainted king, he said. And even Macbeth himself, when he speaks about the king, speaks about his virtues in almost exaggerated terms. When he says, besides this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off, etc., etc. We'll come to this passage later because it's an important passage. So Macbeth himself says, this is the speech of Macbeth when he has not yet killed Duncan, that there can be no more virtuous king, and when he is going to kill such a man. But that's not all. He kills Banquo, he kills a woman, Macduff's wife, he kills children. So from regicide to infanticide, there is no heinous crime that he has not committed, that Macbeth has not committed. And Macbeth leaves a country which the sum total of his villainy, if you like, is described by Ross in Act 4, Scene 3, when he says of Scotland, alas, poor country, almost afraid to know itself, it cannot be called our mother, but our grave, where nothing but who knows nothing is once seen to smile, where sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air are made, not marked, where violent sorrow seems a modern ecstasy. The dead man's knell is there scarce asked for who, and good men's lives expire before the flowers in their caps, dying or they sicken. So I can remember of no other play except probably Richard III, where so much outrage has been committed on goodness, and yet come back to Aristotle and you say, is Macbeth a tragic hero? Now the answer that we have got from critics are quite unsatisfactory. They refer to his valor, his strength, who's called Valor's minion, who's called Bellona's bridegroom early on by the captain, etc., who has saved Scotland from external invasion and from internal insurrection. And the fact that he only has ambition, only but for his ambition he would have been a good man, great man. That seems to me a pathetic explanation. And I mean pathetic because it's only mechanical. It's almost like saying, putting Macbeth at the same level as the other Elizabethan villains or tragic villains with Dr. Foster's, or even more than Foster's, with Marlowe's Jew, Barabbas, or with Tamburlaine, as if there is nothing more to Macbeth than what Mortimer Jr. says about that the wheel of fortune, where he says, of course, Mortimer, base fortune, now I see that in thy will there is a point to which when men aspire, they tumble headlong down. So, or Macbeth is seen like Richard III. I frankly believe looking at Macbeth in that manner and finding his prototype in Richard or in Tamburlaine, the kind of a over Richard, the Marlowean over Richard, what Harry Levin said, would be to miss the central point of Macbeth, to miss its terror, and it would be missing the greatness of Macbeth as a tragedy. And unfortunately, most critics have done that. They have referred to isolated incidents, let's say Laurence Olivier acting Macbeth, and when he says, "Canst thou purge," etc., to the doctor when he comes to attend the Queen, and while saying this, and the sickly commonweal and purge the country, he unconsciously points his finger towards him. That would give us some ground for some sympathy for Macbeth, but that would not reveal our true understanding and the true depth and the true terror of this tragedy. Now, Macbeth has been, whenever we see Macbeth or speak of Macbeth, sorry, it gets entangled with Lady Macbeth, and the common narrative is that Macbeth was a good man. He had ambition. His ambition was stoked by Lady Macbeth, and Lady Macbeth was essentially evil, a chilling human being, almost devilish, a media-like character who worked on Macbeth and who is responsible for what Macbeth has done. This line has been taken, this line of argument has been taken or developed by say, as great a filmmaker as Akira Kurosawa, where Lady Macbeth is a chillingly evil person and Macbeth is under her thumb, and he commits what he does because of Lady Macbeth, under her influence. This is also seen in one important production by Rupert Gould, where Macbeth is seen as an old man, much older than his wife, and the sexual attraction of the wife is responsible, and Macbeth is an uxorious, slightly henpecked person. Even the great Garrick in the 18th century developed Macbeth as someone who falls headlong into evil because of external circumstances, because of his wife. Now, this picture of Lady Macbeth as a media-like character, as a Clytemnestra-like character, and Macbeth as someone who is basically heroic, but then he has one weakness, that is ambition, and therefore he commits this, seems to me thoroughly dissatisfying. So, I would argue that the template of Macbeth should not be seen in either Marlovian tragedies, because in spite of the fact that Marlowe's tragedies were vastly better than Gorboduc, apart from Dr. Foster's, they are hardly tragedies. In fact, they are more melodrama than tragedy. We have all the external trappings, we have the revenge of the Senecan tragedy, but that thing which James Joyce says in The Portrait of an Artist, that it is completely lacking in Marlowe. What does Joyce say? That he speaks about pity and fear, and he describes pity as the feeling which arrests the mind in the presence of whatever is grave and constant in human sufferings, and unites him with the sufferer. Terror is the feeling which arrests the mind in the presence of whatever is grave and constant in human sufferings, and unites it with the secret cause. So, in Marlowe, in Seneca, there is neither the secret cause nor that union that with the sufferer. And the Macbeth that we have seen, seen means that Macbeth that is presented does not have either. In fact, it's a pity that Macbeth has been compared with Richard III. There are a lot of external similarities. Both usurp the throne, both commit multiple atrocious murders, both murder women, both murder children, both die on the battlefield, and that famous soliloquy, "I am in so far blood" of Macbeth is also found in Richard. But Macbeth and Richard are, to me, as different as chalk and cheese, because Richard is high-spirited, witty, unscrupulous, but a very engaging villain. He was the most popular character apart from Falstaff in Shakespeare's days, who almost the Machiavellian villain is almost, the term is almost created for him. It suits him to a T, whereas Macbeth plays the role. He is not that Machiavellian. He is not the Machiavellian villain. He plays. I will come to that later. Now I come to my major argument after a rather longish introduction. I believe that the template of Macbeth has to be found in not Richard, not in other tragedies, that is during the Renaissance, but if at all, it can only be found in one tragedy of Marlowe, and that is Dr. Faustus. Once we understand Dr. Faustus and once we see how much of an improvement Macbeth is on Dr. Faustus, I see all the loose pieces in Macbeth that the eminent critics and great creators have not been able to integrate would fall into place. I am coming to this. Now, let's see my argument. What I am going to argue is Macbeth can be only clearly and wholly and satisfactorily be understood to us if we see Macbeth as damned, and also if we separate the idea of the Renaissance picture of man who has reason, who has agency, and who is free, which has been elaborated most clearly and articulated best in Pico della Mirandola's treatise on the dignity of man, where he says the man is free from the great chain of being, and he alone has the power to fashion himself. So he can be a worm and he can be an angel. And so this is what we have in also echoing him in this picture is echoed by Hamlet when he says, "What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals." But this picture, the new picture of man that the Renaissance gave us, that the humanists gave us, that Shakespeare himself uses, where man has freedom and man has agency, is central to Shakespeare's tragedies. It is also central to some extent, to a lesser extent, in Greek tragedies. In Greek tragedies, men are less free. They are trapped. Oedipus does not know. Oedipus did all that he could to escape his fate, and as a consequence, he is again trapped. Agamemnon had to sacrifice his daughter for the invasion of Troy, and he becomes trapped, and as a result, Aegisthus and Clytemnestra came in. Clytemnestra had to avenge the death of Iphigenia, and as a result, she had to be killed by Orestes. So freedom is less pronounced in Greek tragedy, but the fact is they still had freedom. Agamemnon argues with Menelaus and then decides. Therefore, that argument meant that humans had agency, humans had some degree of freedom. Oedipus could decide that I am not going to kill any man who is my father's age, and not going to marry any woman who is my mother's age. So there is this. But in Shakespeare, you see, Shakespearean tragedy would not exist if humans did not have, the characters did not have agency and they did not have freedom. Even Aristotle decides this or accepts this. But the question is, what kind of freedom does Macbeth have? Let's begin. When Macbeth first meets the witches, look at that. We will deconstruct Macbeth's speeches a little bit to come to my conclusion that the idea of freedom does not exist in the case of Macbeth. When after the witch's prophecies, he says, "This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in truth," etc., etc. And then says, "If good, why do I yield to that suggestion, whose horrid image doth unfix my hair, and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Present fears are less than horrible imaginings. My thought whose murder," I stress the word murder, "yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man, that function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not." At this very moment, two things are clear: that nothing is but what is not. The world of imagination is stronger to Macbeth and has much more power than the world of reality in which he lives. Secondly, Macbeth, there was nothing explicitly in what the witches said that would have prompted Macbeth to think of the murder of the king. As Kenneth Tynan had correctly said, even before he met the witches, in his mind he must have murdered Duncan many times. So the very fact that he speaks of murder means the witches were harping on a thought that had crossed, that had resided, that was deep down in his feeling, in his mind. But that is not all. Macbeth here, this passage which we do not give enough importance, also makes it clear that Macbeth had no control over this thought. He probably needed an external push, but then he is shaking, he is shuddering, and he believes that this is engulfing him, that he is in its thrall. Now this is important. It shakes, so my single state of man, that function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not. If it had just been a thought, these words, Macbeth's words, would be meaningless. It only means we have thoughts here which are not thoughts. It's almost a hallucinatory power of suggestion. It is a hypnotic power of suggestion. It's a weasel between whose teeth Macbeth is caught like a rat. Now, if that is the case, and I have to, you can say that one single passage is not enough to establish this. I'll have to go to another soliloquy or other speeches to understand what is happening. And after maybe another soliloquy or two, I'll come to the theoretical underpinning. Come to the passage on page 163 here, that is, I'm thinking of the Bloomsbury edition, the Arden Shakespeare. Now, again, I would urge everyone to read this not once, but twice or thrice. Macbeth's great soliloquy, where he says, if it were done when it is done, then it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequences and catch with his surcease, his means Duncan's, success, that but this blow might be the be all and the end all here. But here upon this bank and shoal of time, we would jump the life to come. But in these cases, we still have judgment here. That we but teach blood instructions, which being taught return to plague the inventor. This even-handed justice commends the ingredients of the poisoned chalice to our own lips. He is here in double trust. First he says that he is my kinsman, and then I am his host. And finally, when he says that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off, and pity like a naked newborn babe striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent. Here. First, of course, it's just not metaphor, as we see in Macbeth. The natural and the supernatural world, in the mythopoeic world, the cherubs and the sightless couriers and the pronounced. Macbeth is sure that his act will be found out. So he says that even if he was willing to sacrifice heaven and go to hell for, like again, our man Marlowe's Faustus, for pleasure here, that would not come, because there would be retaliation here in this world. And then he has a moral sense which says that it is so outrageous to murder Duncan, who has borne his faculties so meek, has been so clear in his great office. And then he says, so he gives every possible reason that the most talented lawyer could give to say that he cannot do this, that it will not pay. Not only that it is unethical, but that it will not pay. Not only it will damn him, but it is going to be found out, and it will damn him here. But then what happens? Lady Macbeth chips in. Lady Macbeth says, taunts him that you had big dreams, and now when these dreams are coming true, you are developing cold feet, and then said, taunts his manhood. This has been, of course, mentioned endlessly by critics. But if you only see what Lady Macbeth hear what Lady Macbeth says and what Macbeth's initial speech was, it is clear that Lady Macbeth does not answer any of the questions. Here, again, here Macbeth's imagination is rational, means here by rational I mean the Renaissance reason. And he gives us every cause, his conscience, but more than his conscience, he gives us even pragmatic reasons for not doing it. And I would urge my students and others to give due importance to his speech. The fact is, Macbeth says everything that is to be said in favor of abstaining from this deed, and yet he cannot abstain. Now, if I connect this speech with the earlier speech that we said when Macbeth was shuddering, we cannot escape the conclusion that Macbeth is in the grip of a power much stronger and greater than him, that pushes him over the precipice. So Macbeth is not just a villain, and certainly he is nothing of a puny kind of a villain like Richard III. He is basically, he is damned, and this study of damnation was followed. This study followed Dr. Foster's, but Foster's has nothing of it. Foster's does not have it because Macbeth says, there is a speech in Macbeth, that in Dr. Foster's, that where he speaks about hell, that hell is where we are, probably. That is what he says. The exact speech would be that where we are is hell. That's what he says. And in fact, there in the speech, instead of quoting, I am referring to it, is Mephistopheles tells Faustus that hell is not just suffering there, but hell is the separation from God. Hell is a state of mind from which, and all that is not heaven is hell. So we are carrying hell with us. For where we are is hell. That is what Mephisto tells Faustus. And where hell is, there must we ever be. So Macbeth, in the case of Macbeth, this is probably the most precious insight into what hell is by Dr. Faustus. The rest of it, for the first half of it, Dr. Faustus is again the kind of the happy-go-lucky type, or even not probably happy-go-lucky type, but the devil-may-care type of a person. And in the final last half an hour of his speech, where he sees Christ's blood, he redeems himself a bit, but otherwise we do not see, except this one speech, the pain, the suffering, the real stage of what hell means. But then Shakespeare paints hell, what Marlowe says, separation from God, we will see Shakespeare sees it much more strongly than Marlowe. But I would here like to mention that this idea of hell, this idea of damnation, why did it become so popular in the 17th century? Dr. Foster's was published in 1604, though of course he wrote it much earlier. Marlowe was born Shakespeare's age, and he died when he was 29. It was published in 1604. Macbeth was written in 1606, and Paradise Lost was published in 1667. All these are studies in damnation. And why did the 17th century become so preoccupied with the state of damnation? Here lies the secret of Macbeth. Erich Fromm, in his book The Fear of Freedom, tells us that in the 16th century, in the 17th century, there was the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, of not being able to escape hell in spite of what we may try to do, as distinct from the more optimistic theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and the other schoolmen, haunted England and had become a part of the church doctrine by Shakespeare's time. And he says, that is Erich Fromm in his seminal book, that the whole of England and many parts of North Europe were suffering from kind of a mass neurosis bordering almost on psychosis on this fear of damnation and predestination. So this is the theoretical background. Already there are, in these 50, 60 years, 3 studies. Milton's, of course, becomes different because Satan is one of the central characters. But in tragedy, there were just 2 studies. One by Marlowe, and Marlowe introduces the theme, but then there is one big difference between Marlowe's treatment of damnation and hell and Shakespeare's. In Marlowe, this idea of predestination becomes fuzzy because there were these other scholars who were who warned Faustus, but Faustus had knowingly, he had chosen to make a contract with Lucifer, with the devil, in order to have endless power for 25 years. Remember, if we look at Dr. Faustus or Tamburlaine, they were almost Marlowe on a larger scale. Marlowe himself has been called an overreacher, and they were overreachers. So the pain of predestination, the fear, the terror of predestination could not be seen, could not be understood fully in Marlowe. But then in Macbeth, then there is, again, we go back to that soliloquy of Macbeth, where he says that after the murder, he woke up and he's in the next chamber, 2 people were there who woke up and said, prayed to God and said, Amen, and he could not, Amen stuck in his throat. So that he could not pronounce Amen is the clearest statement that Macbeth was damned. And the play actually, and this is what nobody has said, do I sound immodest? Actually uncovers the mode of Macbeth's damnation, the beginning, the middle, and the end. I will just refer to another great soliloquy of damnation. There is another speech by Macbeth where before he speaks about Banquo and says, "And for Banquo's issue have I filed my mind." And he says, "Given the eternal, my eternal jewel to the common enemy of man." Here he himself also clearly says he is damned. But then what I am interested here is to discuss, we don't have so much time left, the nature of his damnation, the mode of the operation of his damnation. Here there is one speech which can be helpful, and that is a dagger speech. Look at here again, and I have been arguing here in my lecture that Macbeth is not free, and without freedom can there be tragedy? But look at, but before that, let us see whether Macbeth is free. There is a dagger scene. Is this a dagger which I see before me? This is Act 2, Scene 1. The handle toward my hand. Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat of pressed brand, etc., etc., etc. So the fact is, again, this speech makes it clear that here, of course, Macbeth was going towards the direction of the king, chamber of the king, and the dagger pulls in there. So take these three soliloquies, and it is clear that Macbeth is, his fate takes the shape of imagination, visual imagination, sometimes auditory imagination, when he thought, "Methought I heard a voice cry, sleep no more, for Macbeth does murder sleep, the innocent sleep," etc., etc. But it is clear that there is no other play in Shakespeare or in Renaissance tragedy where the hero is damned, but he does not choose his damnation, it is his destiny. He is destined to do what he does. Then the question is, what is the role of Lady Macbeth? First, of course, does Lady Macbeth push him into doing this? If he had to do, well, Lady Macbeth is nothing more than a catalyst. And she certainly is not a Medea. She is not a Clytemnestra. Both Clytemnestra and Medea are intensely passionate beings, and they are not even seen as evil because both had reasons. Lady Macbeth, on the other hand, I would say Ellen Terry's Lady Macbeth, or Helen Fawcett's Lady Macbeth, or Judi Dench's Lady Macbeth, where she is inordinately fond of her husband and thinks that her role as a wife is to further her husband's career, and she fulfills this. But she pushes Macbeth, I accept this, but if we read the text well enough, some other case, some other pretext, Macbeth was bound to do what he does. And the fiendish Lady Macbeth of Kurosawa, I cannot at all agree with him, because remember, after Macbeth comes, to me, she is a caring woman, a motherly figure, or a wife rather, who makes one serious wrong decision and a serious wrong assumption. But then you must also accept the fact that in the 11th century, or during even in England later on, during the War of the Roses, murder of a king was nothing exceptional. Even James, one of the courtiers of James I, outraged him by mentioning that in Scotland, in the last 200 years, only 2 kings were allowed to die on their beds. So, Lady Macbeth is, if you take away one such her role there, which when she gets drunk, Dutch courage, pushes her husband to murder and invokes the spirits to go jump out of her skin and be someone else, something else. She is a natural, a normal human being, and who never gets over her guilt. And see still how caring she is, because I just want to mention this fact. Not sad in Act 3, Scene 2, she says, all spent, where our desire is got without content, 'tis safer to be that which we destroy than by destruction dwell in doubtful joy. She says this when she's alone. Macbeth comes in, but the moment Macbeth comes in, she says, how now, my lord? Why do you keep alone? Of sorriest fancies your companion making, using those thoughts which should indeed have died. With them they think on things without all remedy should be without regard. You see, she is suffering from the scorpions of remorse inside her, but she never takes away the protective cover from her husband. She herself is never the focus of her thought. Her one aim is to further her husband's career, to protect her husband, and even in the sleepwalking scene, to bed, however you explain these words, to bed, whether it's an invitation or to rest or a prize for what he has done. Lady Macbeth has to be understood in this way, that and that is the reason, because she takes all the pain herself, all the suffering herself, under the load of the guilt, she breaks up and she commits suicide. But till the last moment, she thinks of her husband. She tries to protect her husband to the last moment of her sanity. Whereas, now, I'll wind up this lecture by saying, then the difference between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth is, Lady Macbeth could see, he had imagination, could see everything, could not prevent this from happening. Lady Macbeth had no imagination. Lady Macbeth thought that one action and the rest would be hunky-dory, the rest would be okay. But to the last, Lady Macbeth was thinking of Macbeth. But what about Macbeth? You see that after the banquet scene, Macbeth was going further away, drifting from Lady Macbeth. And when Lady Macbeth dies, there is a speech of Macbeth who said, she should have died hereafter. What does that mean? That he is, if Lady Macbeth is the least egocentric of all characters, Macbeth is the greatest egoist in the play. He can only think of himself. And that itself is, again, if you look at Macbeth's decline, that itself is an indication of damnation. Actually, Elizabeth Nielsen has said, no actor excelled in the role of Macbeth. For the simple reason, it's not when Gielgud doesn't do, when Olivier doesn't do, when Keane doesn't do, it's not the fault, when McKellen doesn't do, it is not the fault of the actor. The action of Macbeth goes downhill, and there is such decline that from heroic he becomes anti-heroic, and Macbeth's decline can only be, of course that is in the scheme of things, can only be compared with the decline of Satan, who is luminous in book 1, and in book 9 he becomes almost pitiable. But then how do I explain this? Actually, Macbeth's fall can also be explained, because in hell, or when you are, how did actually Marlowe, or to be more precise, Mephisto, explain the state of damnation? As you remain, you're cut off from God. You're cut off from everyone, God's world, from human relationships, finally from the core, the center of your own being. Does that happen in Macbeth? Macbeth, who was Bellona's bridegroom, before his death, when he finds out that Macduff is not born of a woman, he says that I will not fight you. He acts like a coward, and Macduff says, then yield, coward. That's one thing. So that is the final example of Macbeth's alienation from his own being. That he cannot pray, that he cannot repent, is his separation from the world of God, that where we are is hell. And his reaction to so I would just say that Macbeth is alienated from God. He is alienated from society, where he becomes a tyrant, and that is a consequence of his damnation. He is alienated from the self, where he acts as a coward. He is alienated from his partner, where says that she should have died hereafter. And also I would like to point to the fact that Macbeth's horror or his visions are gone in the later part of the play, for the simple reason that Macbeth's horror, even when he heard the witch's prophecy, or when he heard the voices, were there because he was struggling to escape his fate. So and it can only be understood he is trying to escape, not to murder, and the suggestion and the conflict between his reason and his destiny causes him to shudder. The realization that he cannot say Amen, and it means that he is going to hell, is what disturbs him. In the latter half, his hair does not stand on its end, because Macbeth is already, he knows that he is already in hell. So he says this, that in 3:2, but let the frame of things disjoint, both the worlds suffer, we will eat our meal in fear and sleep with the affliction of these terrible dreams that shake us nightly. He is already, actually, things have, the two worlds have disconnected or have become disjointed in his mind. Already he has lost the next world, and he vainly tries to retain the mastery of this world, and he will also lose this world, and that will be meaning that he would go precipitately downhill. That is showing this on stage, downhill movement as the play proceeds and ends doesn't make acting easy, and even Laurence Olivier's great Macbeth was therefore did not draw him many kudos. So, I spoke about Macbeth's damnation, but the difference between Macbeth's damnation and Faustus's is that the theme of predestination is not developed in Faustus, but it is in Macbeth. And therefore, we are brought to again to the 16th and the 17th century England, Church of England, incorporating the doctrine of Calvinism, of hell and of predestination in Macbeth, not in Macbeth, the church, and Macbeth showing this, that's where we are. So finally, we have, what do we have finally? We see the pathway, the trajectory of Macbeth's damnation, of his fall, which had to come, but it did come, and it finally makes him a pitiable creature. But all of this, Macbeth's cowardice, Macbeth's alienation from his wife, Macbeth's alienation from self, all of it can only be understood if damnation can be seen as a state of separation from God, and Macbeth has now been completely separated from God. Now, why finally, last 2 minutes or so, why is this play so disturbing? We have to, this is now where we connect the last part with the early part. There can be no tragedy, Aristotle thought, without the agency of the tragic hero. There could be no tragedy without freedom, agency, and reason that was that could be accessed by the tragic hero in Shakespeare. But we see that Macbeth is the only one tragic hero who does not have freedom in any real sense, because he wanted to escape, but his predestination makes a mockery of his freedom. And what is so frightful about that? Before I'm saying that what is so frightful about that, I would just say that then what is so frightful in Macbeth is that we see there are 2 plays probably that Shakespeare wrote, where there is a crack and a break in the unity between will and reason. One is Hamlet, the other is Macbeth. Hamlet, with all his intelligence, with all his moral sense, wanted to avoid damnation, but we have analyzed the text to show that he was predestined and he could not. And so that is where even Macbeth commits the murder. This is where we go back to James Joyce and say that pity is the feeling which arrests the mind in the presence of whatever is grave and constant, and unites us with the sufferer. So even when the play opens and we see Macbeth's dilemma and Macbeth's destiny, this is where pity is aroused. And here, in a true sense, it is Aristotelian. In Macbeth, of course, and in Hamlet, there is also a break between intellect or reason and will. Hamlet is actually, before Act 4, Scene 4, he is completely self-derogatory. He has no self-esteem. And, what a rogue and a peasant slave am I, and treat every man according to his desert, and who shall escape whipping? And only when he sees Fortinbras invading, fighting, and Fortinbras kind of mobilizing a force that will lead to the death of 20,000 men for a piece of land that has no value at all. It is only then that Hamlet regains his will to follow his reason and to fight and kill Claudius. Of course, we are not going into Hamlet, but in Hamlet, for the most of the play, the will and reason were disjointed. And only when he sees the army moving, he says, rightly to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find quarrel in a straw when honor is at stake. How stand I then that have a father killed, a mother stained, excitements of my reason and my blood? And then he says, and let all sleep. So again, he did not know, it would take us long, in fact, this space would not permit our discussion of Hamlet. But I say that in the whole of the Shakespeare canon, there are just two characters where will is at odds with reason. One is Hamlet, but Hamlet in Act 4, Scene 4, finally redeems his will, finally has control, agency, regains agency to some extent. But Macbeth never does, and that is what is so terrifying. What is so terrifying is that the picture of the Renaissance, and following the Renaissance, the picture of man that we have in the Enlightenment, of agency, of reason, one who is, as Hamlet himself says in that soliloquy, a godlike creature who's like an angel, an apprehension like a god, is shattered. And this Shakespeare discovers a new picture of man and the complete paralysis of will that historically will play out much later in tragic, momentous, and will have momentous consequences in Auschwitz, in Buchenwald. And in the 20th century, after the rise of Hitler, after the dropping of the atom bomb on civilian population, we would see, of course, we would come up to a post-Enlightenment world where reason lay in tatters. And there is only one play of Shakespeare that explores this, and that is what is so terrifying in Macbeth. And that is why G. Wilson Knight calls Macbeth the most terrifying of all his plays. This leads to the world, the post-Enlightenment world, the world where we are closer to the world of Hobbes than to the world of Voltaire, and where the rational hero and the role of reason is dismantled from his throne. And that, I think, is the real power of Macbeth, the real terror of Macbeth. And that can only be understood in the context of the religion that underpins Macbeth. And that is the thing that has been missed by almost all great, so-called great critics who have not been able to explain Macbeth holistically and take the parts, all the parts, and put it into an organic whole. So here I end my lecture.